I'm Ria Almeida, and I'm the creator of the liberation-based healing practice paradigm. And I'm here today to talk about that paradigm and also talk about traditional mental health practices in the US and globally, since many of our practices are exported to many countries around the world. So depression and suicide are worldwide epidemics. In many countries, challenges to these epidemics are really explained in terms of a lack of well-trained psychiatric professionals and also a lack of access to health care. In the United States, these metrics are a little bit different. We do have the number of psychiatric mental health professionals we need, and we certainly do have access to health within certain populations. While there's a lot being done in the United States to reduce the stigma of mental health and also make sure that depression as a form of mental illness is addressed, the epidemic continues even in the United States. Mostly, the care in this country really is triaged between individual therapy, an individual paradigm, and medications. That's pretty much the circle. And if people are suicidal, they're then transported into a hospital stay and then discharged with medications and sent to individual therapy. Now, I want to say something about this notion of individual therapy and why it is a flawed paradigm today. The notion that individual therapy would help somebody who's usually depressed from being isolated, having a lack of connections, and really having trouble in relationships. The idea that isolating them further in an individual context would anyway be healing is a question to be posed and to be answered. A group typically, as we know from the mental health models, is really a circle of sorts that comes together around diagnostic codes. So diagnostic codes such as, again, depression, perhaps addictions, perhaps divorced or married, parents with PTSD, parents who have children who have ADHD, and you get the point. It's solely organized around diagnostic codes and not around people's lived experiences. Now, while there's a lot of research in the United States that's being done to destigmatize mental health and also research ways in which medication can handle and target chemical imbalances, we know for a fact that all of these research studies have done very little to affect the outcome of the level of mental health, depression, and suicide challenges in this country. Given the fact that medications, while some do work for some people, there's often a revolving door with the medications. We also have to be cautious and critical of the ways in which pharmaceutical companies have actually pushed the medications and how there's been medical consensus around the use of certain medications, like the opioid crisis that we have in this country today. We do know for a fact that many young adolescents are prescribed medications, many medications that are not necessarily tested in terms of the ways they impact young children. What we also know from doing this work for 20 plus years and serving over 2,000 people is that we've had very few hospitalizations that were necessary, and very few of our clients have been on medications. Liberation-based healing circles is the approach that I am offering as really an alternative to traditional mental health practices. We call it liberation-based healing circles, and liberation-based healing circles really are a way not only to potentially target many more people with well-qualified professionals, but we also provide the opportunity to address issues like social isolation. A lot of communities that have either elderly or families that are split, so there's a high level of loneliness, and there's a lack of connections among many people in our communities today. The healing circles provide all of that as a way of creating a community that provides for these healing systems that are absent in our culture today. Healing circles are really organized around lived experiences, and so there's a wide range of people that come together along the life cycle, along class, around race, and gender, and also people with different identified challenges. They may be challenges around health, for example, people with chronic illness, people facing issues around cancer, or people dealing with a range of mental health issues, or as a case I'll talk about in today's presentation, is also children who come in, parents who come in and bring their children around presenting issues of academic failure or academic and peer-related issues. The healing circles actually challenge and counter this notion of individuality that's very well established in this culture as a measure of health. And we do know that that notion of individuality as a measure of health is seriously flawed. We do know for a fact that people who buy into the notion of individuality are often lonely, they're isolated, and they're not really able to live in places where connections are required for their mental health. So that idea that's very well established, and in fact therapy supports it, is an idea that's flawed if we're looking at outcomes that really make a difference in people's lives. The healing circles do a number of things. They counter the notion of individuality. They counter the notion that autonomy is necessarily a level of or a measure of maturity and strength. It also counters the isolation and the lack of connections that many people experience. Liberation-based healing practices considers the ways in which all of these threads of power, privilege, and oppression, coupled with societal expectations, really threads into people's lives and create the kinds of mental health issues many people face. So I want to talk to you about a couple of cases today and sort of offer you the vibrancy that people can actually harvest through the healing circles. Let's consider Lila, who's actually 26 years old. She's a woman with a 9-month-old baby, and both she and her husband work many hours. They have a hard time paying for childcare, and she does not have any resources that she has been able to garner in order to help her with childcare. So she comes in presenting with depression, and we invite her and her husband in for a consultation, and it turns out that the depression is really linked to all of these life choices that she finds herself struggling with. We invite her to the healing circle, and in the healing circle she meets a lot of different women along many different trajectories of life, women of different ages, women at different points in terms of their childbearing years. And she learns that they all have had to literally, patchwork a quilt of child caregivers in order to be successful to raise children. Some of them, of course, have had access to finances that have allowed them to buy affordable childcare. But many of them begin to raise the question that she is really very much stuck with, which is the idea that as an autonomous and a healthy individual, she needs to be able to figure this out on her own. And in searching more for where that idea comes from, she tells us that the main reason she's not willing to ask her in-laws and her family is because they'd all warned her that she should have a fairly strong financial repository before she chose to have a child, since childcare is very expensive. So her pride and her belief that autonomy was important led her to believe that she should not ask anyone for help. And she was able to really connect with her family, request for help from friends and family, and she really saw the benefit of having her child raised in the community rather than being raised alone or with a solo sitter. I also want to talk about Sheila, who's 30 years old, who presented as very depressed. Sheila has a successful job. She has a condominium that she owns, and she's successful by all the metrics that we would define as success. However, she feels that there's no potential mate looming, and the possibility of her being pregnant anytime soon is quite remote. And so she feels that that is the one place where she's failed in her life. And in having her talk to a lot of the women, and again, view a lot of film clips and social media that talk about these various ideas and social expectations, that come from society that women actually, and men too, carry as their own sort of personal stories without linking them to the larger societal norms that in fact thread into their personal lives. And in viewing a lot of these movies and having several dialogues and reflections and inquiry, she comes to realize that these were not issues that she thought about herself. She was quite surprised to realize that she had slowly sort of embedded and swallowed the ideas where people expected that by age 30 she was expected to be married and have a baby. Nobody had actually said that to her in one particular sentence, but as she reflected in all of the subtle messages she got, not just from people around her, but from movies, you know, from stories that she read in the media, that they were these subtle messages sent to her that she incorporated. And she too was able to really shed that notion that there was a particular life trajectory that she had to go by, that she was her own writer of her own life, and that she would decide at what point she would have a child, if she ever would have a child. People being in dialogue around the movie clips and around social media, and being in inquiry and reflection is really the process of critical consciousness. So raising critical consciousness is key to these healing circles. Through developing critical consciousness, people then are able to target and really gather various ways of empowering themselves, and there are systems of accountability that are also well rooted in the process of liberation-based healing practices. To go now to another story of Jeff, a young man who was 16 years old, who was in fact brought to therapy by his parents because of their frustration and concern that he was no longer willing to live within the rules of their home. And he was also challenging the authority at the school at levels that were really of concern to the school and to the parents. So in the home, he had actually trashed a lot of his family's belongings. He had put holes in the wall, and he'd actually barricaded himself for hours and at some points overnight in his room, because he was not willing to give up his computer after a certain point in the evening. The parents had actually given him a consequences of taking the computer away after a certain number of hours because he had been surfing sites they were not comfortable with. He had also started to smoke marijuana because he believed that it had a calming influence on him, and that was not acceptable to the parents. So Jeff and his family and his siblings came in for a consultation. And after that consultation, we actually requested that they each be in their own respective circles, which they agreed to. Jeff was in a circle with his peers and with people who had been there longer and who addressed many of their own issues, so they were able to act as sort of sponsors or allies to his healing process. In that circle, we were able to share with him and the other members various film clips that relate to young men and women, to adolescents in particular, stories that really address many of the challenges kids have, you know, in school, in their lives, with their parents, and all of the ways that adolescence can sometimes be a really challenging life cycle experience.
I want you to think about the characters, specific main characters in that video clip we just watched. So, what are some of the characters you guys remember?
Elliot.
Elliot, for sure.
I know one.
Who else?
The ballet person who knows a lot of ballet.
The teacher?
The teacher?
Yes.
His father and his grandmother.
The father, the grandmother. Who else?
His brother. I was going to say brother.
His brother.
I said it.
Do is we're going to try to locate them or place them into this hierarchy. This is going to help us look at how people have power based on the color of their skin, or how much money they have, or whether they're men or women, and whether they are gay
Brother or sister?
or heterosexual.
A brother or sister? What's that?
Does everyone know
I know
what heterosexual means or gay means?
In the circles, he watched different movies. He brought various lyrics of songs that he liked, and there was an analysis around the lyrics and what they meant. And this process of reflection and dialogue and inquiry really got him in touch with ways in which he had really been very lonely and isolated for much of his life. There were lots of conversations by other members of his circle who really challenged him about the ways in which he went about living his life, ways in which he had indicated to us that he found friendships by in fact doing other students' papers and getting paid $100 to do them. That was the way he kept his friends. He also talked about the ways in which he would share his rage towards other kids who may be popular, but who may be of a different race, or perhaps gender nonconforming. He would tend to humiliate them verbally or send awful texts about them. And people in his circle began to challenge that and really talk about ways in which he could consider having friends, but using different approaches. He was able to, in fact, then be able to write a letter to his parents about how all the tics that he had had for many years, which were clearly very humiliating and caused a lot of the kids to mock him, how that led to his isolation, and the parents did not really see that as an issue, did not notice it, and neither did the school personnel. Because he was an honor student, a lot of the ways he operated just went under the radar, his whole sense of emotional well-being, until it got to the point where he was literally threatening people and physically aggressive towards his own family. Did the family bring him into therapy? He found a place of safe connections and a place where he was embraced while also being held accountable for some of the choices he made. The healing circles offer people a place where they can come together from multiple spaces with really different challenges that each one presents, and they're able to really engage in cross dialogues. They're able to actually gather social capital from one another. They're able to really address the fact that even though they come from different spaces, there are common threads in their life experience. And even though they may not be common threads in their life experience, they're able to actually borrow from each other in ways that are life-affirming. The circle also offers a structural level of support and embraceable connections that again counter the loneliness and isolation that most people experience. Liberation-based healing practices really are a way to bring various systems of power, privilege, and oppression into the healing endeavor, and really offer people ways and places to connect and heal outside of spaces of isolation. This process of critical consciousness, empowerment, and accountability are a powerful way to help people heal going forward. Thank you.